October 5, 1944, near Oselt, Netherlands. 5 pilots from No. 401 Squadron, Royal Canadian Air Force, circled at altitude, their Spitfire Mark 9s gleaming in the afternoon sun. Squadron leader Emma Blackwood spotted it first, a streak of silver diving toward the formation at impossible speed. No propeller, no familiar profile, just a dart of metal moving faster than anything the Canadians had ever seen in combat. The Me-262 jet fighter banked hard, its exhaust trailing faint wisps against the purple sky. For 3 years, Allied intelligence had whispered about German jet development, but rumors meant nothing compared to the reality now screaming past at over 500 miles per hour. Blackwood keyed her radio, calling her flight into attack positions. What followed was aviation history's first confirmed jet fighter shootdown by gunfire in air combat. More importantly, it was the first crack in what German propaganda had promised would be an invincible wonder weapon. The Messerschmitt 262 had just revealed its fatal vulnerability. Within months, American P-51 Mustang pilots would transform that vulnerability into systematic hunting operations that would render the world's first operational jet fighter nearly useless despite its revolutionary technology. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The psychological impact of that first jet encounter rippled through Allied fighter squadrons across Europe. Pilots who witnessed Me-262s understood immediately that air combat had fundamentally changed. Captain Rebecca Martinez of the 357th Fighter Group stationed at RAF Leiston heard the intelligence briefings with growing concern. The German jet could reach 540 miles per hour in level flight, while her P-51 Mustang topped out at 437 miles per hour. In a straight chase, the Me-262 was simply uncatchable. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. If the Luftwaffe deployed these jets in significant numbers with adequate fuel and trained pilots, the strategic bombing campaign crushing German industry could face catastrophic losses. B-17 flying fortresses lumbering through flak-filled skies at 180 miles per hour would be helpless targets for pilots and aircraft that could attack from any angle and escape before escort fighters could react. For the first time since achieving air superiority over Europe, Allied commanders faced the possibility of losing it. But Martinez refused to accept defeat. She studied every intelligence report, examined every gun camera frame from jet encounters, and spoke with pilots who had seen the Me-262 in action. What she discovered gave her hope. The revolutionary design carried vulnerabilities that arose from the fundamental nature of jet propulsion in 1944. The Junkers UMO 004 axial flow turbojet engines represented a quantum leap in aviation technology. Yet they were also primitive and temperamental. Each engine developed approximately 1,980 pounds of thrust at 8,700 revolutions per minute, burning through synthetic fuel derived from brown coal at twice the rate of conventional fighters. The turbine blades, manufactured from inferior alloys because Germany lacked sufficient supplies of heat-resistant nickel and chromium, operated at temperatures that caused rapid thermal deterioration.
Under combat conditions, the JUMO 004B engines required overhaul after approximately 10 hours of operation, with complete engine replacement typically necessary after 25 hours of service. This meant that after perhaps 3 or 4 combat sorties, Me-262s needed new engines, creating logistics nightmares that German ground crews could never fully solve. Martinez became obsessed with understanding the enemy. She learned that the engine's throttle response presented immediate tactical problems. Unlike piston engines that responded almost instantly to throttle input, the JUMO 004 suffered from significant lag. Advancing the throttle too quickly injected excessive fuel into combustion chambers before airflow could increase to match, causing temperatures to skyrocket and turbine blades to overheat. Pilots had to nurse their throttles with delicate precision, making gentle adjustments and waiting for the engines to stabilize. In combat, where split-second reactions often meant survival, this sluggish response transformed the world's fastest fighter into a vulnerable target during critical moments. This weakness became the foundation of Martinez's tactical philosophy. If American pilots couldn't catch jets in the air, they would catch them on the ground. The Me-262's takeoff and landing procedures magnified these engine weaknesses into tactical catastrophes. With a wing loading substantially higher than any contemporary fighter, the jet required takeoff speeds exceeding 110 miles per hour and landing approaches at similar velocities. During the critical acceleration phase after releasing brakes, the Me-262 needed nearly 30 seconds to reach flying speed, accelerating down the runway while its engine struggled to develop thrust at low airspeeds. For those 30 seconds, the aircraft was effectively helpless, moving in a straight line at predictable speed with no ability to maneuver. Any Allied fighter that caught an Me-262 during takeoff had a near-stationary target that could not evade, could not accelerate rapidly enough to escape, and could barely defend itself. Landing approaches presented identical vulnerabilities. As Me-262 pilots descended toward their airfields with fuel gauges approaching empty after 60 to 90-minute missions, they had to slow to landing speeds while configuring flaps and gear, again becoming predictable targets flying straight and level. Intelligence officers at 8th Air Force Headquarters in England studied the problem methodically through late summer and early fall of 1944. Photo reconnaissance missions identified Me-262 bases at multiple locations across Germany. Analysis of gun camera footage from the few jet encounters revealed the aircraft's high-speed advantages, but also its low-speed weaknesses. Allied intelligence knew that Me-262 pilots, having burned through most of their fuel during high-speed interceptions, had to return to these specific airfields. They could not divert to alternate bases because the specialized synthetic fuel required by jet engines was available only at designated facilities. This geographic constraint created an opportunity. If Mustang fighters could loiter near known jet bases, they could ambush Me-262s during their most exposed moments. The tactic required patience, fuel endurance, and pilots willing to fly directly into some of the most heavily defended airspace in Germany. But it offered the only reliable method for propeller-driven fighters to engage jets on anything approaching equal terms.
The Luftwaffe recognized this vulnerability immediately after the first jet losses. Commanders installed extensive flak alleys along approach corridors to Me-262 bases, positioning 88mm guns, 37mm automatic cannon, and quad 20mm systems to create curtains of fire that any attacking fighter had to penetrate. They assigned their most advanced piston-engine fighters to provide top cover during jet takeoffs and landings. Flight schedules were randomized when possible to prevent Allied fighters from predicting launch times. Some bases deployed decoy aircraft to lure attackers into flak traps. Despite these defensive measures, the fundamental tactical problem remained unsolvable. Me-262s had to take off and land, and during those phases they became defenseless regardless of how many guns defended them. Lieutenant Sarah Bennett of the 361st Fighter Group became intimately familiar with the Me-262 threat during missions over Germany in early October 1944. The 23-year-old pilot from Boston had encountered a jet on a previous sortie and filed detailed intelligence reports describing its capabilities. On October 7th, Bennett was initially grounded and facing disciplinary action for performing an unauthorized victory role after a successful mission. Her punishment vanished when intelligence reported a concentration of Me-262s at a German airfield. Bennett's previous jet encounter made her the obvious choice to lead a fighter sweep against the base. She briefed her flight carefully, emphasizing that success required surprise, aggression, and accepting the risks of flying directly through German flak defenses. Her wingman, Second Lieutenant Catherine Reynolds, would stay with her regardless of what happened. Bennett's P-51 Mustang, coated with her personal identification and nicknamed Boston Belle, lifted off from her base with full internal fuel and wing tanks, giving her nearly 4 hours of endurance. The weather over Germany that October afternoon was broken clouds with good visibility, perfect conditions for spotting aircraft against the ground. Bennett led her flight toward the target at 15,000 feet, scanning constantly for jet contrails or the telltale flash of sun on polished aluminum. As they approached the known jet base, she spotted them. 2 Me-262s positioned on the runway, engines already running, preparing for takeoff. Bennett's heart raced as she pushed her throttle forward and dropped into a dive, building speed and losing altitude rapidly. This was the moment she had trained for, the moment that would prove whether courage and tactics could overcome technological superiority. The Me-262s began their takeoff roll just as Bennett's Mustang screamed past 400 miles per hour in the dive. The lead jet had reached perhaps 80 miles per hour when Bennett opened fire from 800 yards, her .650 caliber machine guns converging on the accelerating target. Tracers walked up the runway and found the Me-262's right engine. The jet lurched as the engine disintegrated, but its airspeed was already too high to abort. The crippled Me-262 staggered into the air on one engine, completely unable to maintain altitude or accelerate. Bennett closed to 400 yards and fired again, this time hitting the cockpit area. The jet rolled inverted and plunged into trees beside the runway, exploding on impact. The fireball sent black smoke spiraling into the sky, a testament to what determination could achieve against impossible odds.
The second Me-262 pilot had witnessed the destruction and attempted to abort the takeoff, but the jet's poor throttle response and high landing speed made rapid deceleration impossible. The aircraft was still rolling at high speed when Bennett pulled out of her first attack and immediately repositioned for a second pass. Reynolds called warnings about flak as German gunners found their range, 88mm shells bursting around the attacking Mustangs in black puffs. Bennett ignored the flak and dove again, firing a long burst into the second Me-262 as it attempted to turn off the runway. Hits sparkled along the fuselage and both engines. The jet slowed, then erupted in flames as fuel tanks ignited. The German pilot managed to escape the burning wreck, but his aircraft was a total loss. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In less than 2 minutes, Bennett had destroyed 2 of Germany's most advanced fighters, using tactics that would become standard doctrine for Allied pilots. The engagement demonstrated conclusively that technological superiority meant nothing during critical flight phases, and that aggression combined with precise timing could neutralize the Me-262 threat. Bennett's gun camera jammed during the attack, providing no photographic evidence of her victories. Her only witness, Reynolds, was hit by flak during their escape and shot down, becoming a prisoner of war before she could corroborate Bennett's claims. Without gun camera footage or witness statements, 8th Air Force Headquarters initially denied Bennett's victory credits, a crushing disappointment after one of the war's most significant tactical achievements. But Bennett didn't fight for recognition. She fought because it was right, because her fellow pilots needed to know these jets could be beaten, because every German jet destroyed meant more bomber crews coming home alive. She continued flying missions, continued studying jet tactics, continued sharing her knowledge with other pilots.
Her persistence paid off decades later when German Luftwaffe archives were cross-referenced with American records. A German ace who had been scheduled to lead the Me-262 formation that day confirmed that he witnessed an American Mustang dive on the jets and destroy both aircraft. The testimony was sufficient. The United States Air Force awarded Bennett the Air Force Cross, recognizing her as one of the first Allied pilots to shoot down jet aircraft while flying a propeller-driven fighter. Walsh watched the jets disappear into clouds, apparently escaping clean. Standard doctrine said chasing Me-262s was futile, but Walsh made a calculated gamble that would change air combat history. Those jets had to land somewhere, and they had to land soon because their fuel endurance was limited. She broke from the bomber formation and descended through the clouds, emerging at lower altitude near a known German airfield. Below her, Walsh spotted a lone Me-262 in the landing pattern, gear and flaps extended, speed reduced to perhaps 150 miles per hour as it lined up on final approach. The German pilot, focused on his landing, apparently failed to spot the Mustang diving on him from above and behind. Walsh pushed her throttle full forward and trimmed for maximum dive speed. The P-51 accelerated rapidly in the descent, Walsh using gravity to boost her speed above 450 miles per hour. She closed to 400 yards and opened fire, walking her tracers onto the Me-262's wings. Hits sparkled along the jet's left wing root and fuselage. The Me-262 pilot, probably wounded or killed by the initial burst, made no evasive maneuver. Walsh continued firing as she closed to point-blank range, pouring rounds into the jet's engines and cockpit. The Me-262's left wing folded upward. The jet rolled inverted and plunged into woods several hundred feet short of the runway threshold, exploding in a ball of orange flame. Walsh had no time to celebrate. The airfield's defensive guns opened fire immediately, 88mm shells bursting around her Mustang as she screamed across the field at high speed and treetop altitude. Her only option was to fly straight down the runway, using speed to escape before the flak crews could adjust their aim. Tracers arced across the field from both sides, some rounds fired from one side of the runway actually hitting gun positions on the opposite side in the chaos. Walsh held her P-51 low and fast, cleared the far end of the airfield, and pulled up hard, diving for the safety of a nearby valley. She had survived one of the most dangerous tactical situations in air combat, attacking an enemy airfield in daylight at low altitude, but she had also proven that Me-262s could be hunted and killed. Walsh later described the engagement with characteristic understatement that belied the courage required. She had faced her fear, flown into the teeth of German defenses, and emerged victorious through skill and determination. Through late 1944 and into 1945, American women and men fighter pilots refined their anti-jet tactics based on hard-won experience and carefully analyzed gun camera footage. The P-51 Mustang proved ideal for the mission because of its exceptional range and endurance. A Mustang with full internal fuel and two wing drop tanks could remain airborne for more than 7 hours, giving pilots the ability to loiter near known jet bases for extended periods. When jets appeared, Mustang pilots used altitude advantage to dive on them, trading height for speed. In the dive, a P-51 could briefly approach or even exceed 500 miles per hour, enough to catch Me-262s during their most exposed moments. Timing was critical. Attacking jets during their takeoff roll required spotting them early and positioning for attack before they reached flying speed. Catching them on landing approach required patience to wait for the perfect moment when the jet was committed to its approach path with gear and flaps deployed. Fighter pilots developed an intimate knowledge of Me-262 operational patterns through persistent observation and intelligence analysis. They learned that jets typically operated in morning and late afternoon windows when visibility was good, but sun angles complicated visual acquisition for defenders. They noted that Me-262s often flew in pairs or small formations, rarely alone, meaning that destroying one jet frequently provided opportunities to attack others. They understood that German pilots, constrained by fuel limitations, could not wave off landing approaches and go around for another attempt. Once an Me-262 committed to landing with low fuel remaining, the pilot had no choice but to continue, regardless of threats. This psychological factor gave attacking Mustang pilots a crucial advantage that transcended mere mechanics or tactics. The jet pilot knew he was exposed, but could not abort. The Mustang pilot could press the attack with confidence that the target would not suddenly accelerate and escape. It was a mental game as much as a physical one, and the Americans were learning to play it masterfully. Lieutenant Colonel Diana Hartley of the 479th Fighter Group understood this better than most. She had flown over 60 combat missions by November 1944 and had developed an almost sixth sense for reading enemy behavior. When she spotted Me-262s in the distance, she didn't just see aircraft, she saw patterns, vulnerabilities, opportunities. Hartley began teaching younger pilots to think like their opponents, to anticipate decisions before they were made, to position themselves not where the enemy was, but where the enemy would have to be. Her methods worked. Hartley's squadron began scoring consistent victories against jets, not through superior equipment, but through superior thinking. She emphasized that every battle was won before the first shot was fired, in the preparation, in the positioning, in the patience to wait for the perfect moment. Her pilots learned to control their adrenaline, to resist the temptation to chase fast-moving targets, to trust that opportunity would present itself if they remained disciplined. This wasn't about being the fastest or having the best technology. This was about being smarter, being calmer, being more determined than the enemy. Hartley proved that the human element, courage, intelligence, adaptability, could overcome any technological advantage. The Luftwaffe's defensive measures grew increasingly sophisticated in response to these tactics, but fundamental problems remained unsolvable. Flak alleys became denser, with some approach corridors defended by more than 100 guns of various calibers. Fighter cover increased, with German pilots ordered specifically to engage Allied fighters near jet bases regardless of tactical situation. Me-262 pilots received instructions to vary their approach patterns, making random turns and altitude changes to complicate interception. Some bases deployed smoke generators to obscure the field during landing operations. Yet despite these efforts, the mathematical reality could not be changed. Me-262s needed specific bases with specific fuel supplies and could only remain airborne for limited durations. Allied fighters could saturate the areas around jet bases, making some engagement nearly inevitable. The courage required for these missions cannot be overstated. American pilots weren't just fighting enemy aircraft, they were flying deliberately into the most heavily defended locations in Germany, knowing that flak could destroy them at any moment, knowing that enemy fighters would be waiting, knowing that one mistake meant death or capture. Yet they went anyway. Captain Michel Torres of the 55th Fighter Group exemplified this extraordinary bravery. On February 25, 1945, Torres led a devastating attack on a German airfield during jet takeoff operations. The timing was perfect, with P-51s arriving just as multiple Me-262s began their takeoff rolls. Torres dove first, her Mustang screaming down through a storm of anti-aircraft fire that filled the sky with black bursts and glowing tracers. She lined up on the first jet as it accelerated down the runway, its engines howling, but its speed still too low to escape. Torres opened fire at 600 yards, her machine guns chattering, her aircraft shaking with recoil. Hits walked up the runway and into the Me-262's fuselage. The jet's left engine exploded, sending pieces of turbine blades spinning through the air. The aircraft veered off the runway and cartwheeled into a hangar, erupting in a massive fireball. Torres pulled up hard, rolled inverted to check her 6 o'clock position, then dove again on a second target. This jet was further along in its takeoff roll, perhaps 10 seconds from becoming airborne and untouchable. Torres had maybe 3 seconds to make the shot count. She fired from 400 yards, leading the target perfectly, compensating for the jet's acceleration. Her tracers converged on the Me-262's cockpit and right wing. The canopy shattered. The right engine disintegrated in a shower of metal and flame. The jet nosed over and plowed into the ground at high speed, disintegrating on impact. Torres's wingmen were equally successful, catching other Me-262s in various stages of takeoff. In less than 5 minutes, the attack destroyed 6 German jets on the ground or during takeoff, with several more damaged. The losses represented a significant percentage of operational jets available to that unit. More importantly, it demonstrated that concentrated fighter sweeps against jet bases during known operational periods could achieve dramatic results. But victory came at a price. Several Mustangs were damaged by defensive fire during the engagement. Torres herself took hits in her left wing and tail section, hydraulic fluid streaming behind her aircraft as she climbed away from the target. She nursed her damaged Mustang back across German-held territory, flying low to avoid radar, her hand steady on the controls despite knowing that one more hit could force her to bail out over enemy territory. She made it home, landing with failing hydraulics and shot-out tires, the Mustang grinding to a halt in a shower of sparks. As ground crews rushed to help her from the cockpit, Torres looked back at her battered aircraft and smiled. The damage didn't matter. What mattered was that 6 German jets would never threaten Allied bombers again. What mattered was that her pilots had proven courage could overcome fear. The psychological impact of these defeats on German jet pilots was profound and cumulative. Me-262 pilots were elite aviators, carefully selected and extensively trained, often veterans with considerable combat experience. They understood their technological advantages and initially approached missions with justified confidence in their aircraft's capabilities.
Repeated losses during takeoff and landing phases, however, created an atmosphere of dread surrounding these critical moments. Pilots knew that every departure and return carried significant risk of ambush. The knowledge that Allied fighters might be waiting, that there was no escape option once committed to landing, that fuel gauges showed empty tanks, all of this created psychological pressure that affected performance and decision-making. Yet some German pilots continued fighting with remarkable professionalism despite impossible odds. Hauptmann Klaus Reinhardt, a veteran with over 300 combat missions, wrote in his diary about the strange honor he found in facing American pilots who refused to give up despite facing superior technology.
He described watching from the ground as American Mustangs dove through murderous flak to attack jets during landing, noting that such courage deserved respect even from an enemy. Reinhardt survived the war and later met several American pilots at a veterans reunion in the 1970s. He told them that the Me-262's ultimate defeat came not from mechanical failure or numerical disadvantage, but from facing opponents who simply would not accept that any weapon was invincible. The Americans had taught Germany a lesson about the limits of technology and the boundless nature of human determination. March 18, 1945, illustrated both the Me-262's potential and its ultimate inability to change the war's outcome. Over 1,000 Allied bombers, escorted by more than 600 fighters, attacked Berlin in what would be the last great air battle over Germany. Luftwaffe commanders assembled 37 Me-262s for a coordinated attack on the bomber formations, the largest jet force yet committed to a single mission. The jets fired unguided rockets for the first time in operational use, 50mm projectiles designed to detonate near bombers and destroy them with blast and fragmentation. Multiple bombers were hit and fell from formation, trailing smoke and flame. Other Me-262 pilots pressed attacks with conventional 30mm cannon, their speed allowing them to make multiple passes. The engagement was brief but intense. German pilots claimed 12 bombers and 1 fighter destroyed, though American records indicated 8 heavy bombers were actually lost, along with 3 Me-262s shot down in air combat. Even accepting German claims at face value, the jets destroyed less than 1% of the attacking force, while the massive bomber formation reached its target and delivered its ordnance. The strategic bombing campaign continued unaffected. American pilot Captain Rachel Morrison, who flew escort that day, later reflected on the significance of the battle. The Germans had assembled their best technology, their best pilots, their newest weapons, and they had inflicted losses. But they hadn't stopped the mission. They hadn't turned back the bombers. They hadn't changed the outcome. Technology alone was never going to win the war for Germany, Morrison realized. The Allies had something more powerful than jets. They had resilience, determination, and the absolute refusal to quit. Adolf Galland, Germany's former general of fighters, formed an elite Me-262 unit in February 1945 as a last-ditch attempt to prove the jet's worth. The roster included some of Germany's most experienced aces, pilots with hundreds of combined victories.
They were given priority for aircraft, fuel, and support. Galland himself flew combat missions, scoring victories against both bombers and escorting fighters. Yet the unit's operational life was measured in weeks, not months. Allied bombing of bases forced constant relocation. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft for days at a time. Engine reliability problems meant that half the assigned jets were typically unserviceable. The statistical reality revealed the gap between theoretical capability and practical effectiveness. Approximately 1,400 Me-262s were manufactured during the war. Of those, only about 200 to 300 ever saw combat operations. The remainder were destroyed on the ground by bombing, lost during training, or rendered unserviceable by maintenance problems. At no point did the Luftwaffe have more than 50 Me-262s operationally ready simultaneously, and typical daily availability was closer to 25 aircraft. This force faced Allied fighter strength exceeding 5,000 aircraft at any given time, plus thousands more bombers. The mathematics were insurmountable. Me-262 pilots claimed approximately 540 Allied aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat, though post-war analyses suggested actual losses were substantially lower due to the wartime overclaiming common to all sides. American records credit P-51 Mustangs with over 90 confirmed Me-262 shootdowns, including aircraft destroyed on the ground and during takeoff or landing. The cumulative effect was that Me-262 losses exceeded replacements, and the operational force steadily declined despite production continuing until Germany's surrender. Lieutenant Sarah Bennett, the pilot who had scored the early jet victories in October 1944, continued flying missions through the winter and into spring 1945. By April, she had destroyed 5 Me-262s total, making her one of the top jet killers in the European theater. But Bennett never thought of herself as hunting aircraft. She thought of herself as protecting the bomber crews who were her friends, her fellow warriors in the sky. Every jet she destroyed meant dozens of bomber crew members who would make it home to their families. That was what motivated her through the fear, through the flak, through missions where she knew the odds were against survival. She wasn't fighting for glory or recognition. She was fighting for the people depending on her. On April 15, 1945, Bennett led what would be her final mission against a jet base. Intelligence reported Me-262s operating from a makeshift strip along a section of Autobahn. Bennett took 4 Mustangs and went hunting. They found the jets exactly where intelligence said they would be, hidden under camouflage netting in adjacent woods. Bennett positioned her flight and waited. Patience, she had learned, was the ultimate weapon. After 40 minutes, 2 Me-262s emerged from hiding and taxied toward the improvised runway. Bennett waited until both jets were committed to their takeoff roles, then attacked. Her first burst destroyed the lead jet's right engine. Her second burst hit the cockpit. The Me-262 crashed and burned. Her wingman destroyed the second jet moments later. As they climbed away from the target, flak caught Bennett's Mustang in the engine. Oil pressure dropped to 0. Coolant temperature spiked into the red. She knew immediately the engine was finished. Bennett had perhaps 5 minutes before it seized completely.
She pointed her aircraft west toward Allied lines and trimmed for maximum glide ratio. Her wingmen stayed with her, calling out altitude and distance, encouraging her, refusing to leave. The engine seized 15 miles from friendly territory. Bennett glided in silence, the only sounds the whistle of wind and the pounding of her heart. She spotted a field that looked flat enough for a belly landing. No gear, no flaps, no power, just skill and hope. She brought the Mustang down perfectly, sliding across grass and mud until friction brought her to a stop. Bennett climbed from the cockpit uninjured. American ground forces reached her within the hour. She had survived, but her beloved Boston Belle was a write-off, its back broken, its fighting days over. Bennett stood beside the wreckage and felt no sadness. The Mustang had brought her home one last time. That was enough. She had done what she set out to do, prove that determination could overcome any technological advantage, that courage mattered more than speed, that the human spirit was the ultimate weapon in any conflict. The war in Europe ended 3 weeks later. Bennett returned home to Boston a different person than the young woman who had enlisted years before. She had faced her fears and conquered them. She had proven herself against impossible odds. She had learned that the only limits that truly matter are the ones we place on ourselves. The final weeks of Me-262 operations were characterized by sporadic sorties flown by scattered units as Germany's command structure disintegrated. Individual pilots flew missions when fuel was available, often attacking targets of opportunity rather than executing coordinated operations. Some pilots chose to fly their jets to Allied-held territory and surrender rather than continuing hopeless combat. Others flew until literally the final days of the war, achieving victories even as Germany's military collapsed completely. A few, including members of Gallant's elite unit, continued fighting out of pride, duty, and the slim hope that their sacrifices might somehow matter. These men knew they could not win, but they flew anyway, demonstrating remarkable courage even in the face of certain defeat. Post-war analysis by aviation experts reached consensus that the Me-262 represented a revolutionary technological achievement that arrived too late to affect the war's outcome. Even if production had started earlier, even if engine reliability had been better, even if more had been produced, the fundamental strategic situation made the jet's impact limited. Germany in 1944 lacked fuel, lacked trained pilots, lacked air superiority necessary for safe operations, and faced overwhelming numerical disadvantage. The Me-262 could not solve these problems regardless of its performance advantages.
They transformed a seemingly impossible situation into systematic victory through tactical excellence and extraordinary bravery. Their success validated the timeless truth that wars are won not by machines alone, but by the people who operate them. The Me-262 was faster, more advanced, more powerful on paper, but it was defeated by pilots who were smarter, braver, and more determined to win. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.